My Lords, I rise to move the question that clause 62 should stand part of the bill, with the intention of removing provisions that compel employers to allow time off for trade union equality reps. To note, I am not opposed to trade union facilities time per se. I'm actually not objecting to clause 61 in relation to learning reps. My concern is specifically on the nature of equality as it has been interpreted by the trade unions in recent years. The divisive nature of its adherence to identity politics, for example, and the ideologically contentious implementation of prescriptive policies, often setting one group of workers against another. Trade union priorities under the auspices of fighting for equality have been skewed, to say the least. The wording in this unfeasibly long clause states at 12b(1) that equality in relation to the workplace means the elimination of discrimination, harassment and victimisation in accordance with the Equality Act 2010. You'd think I'd have nothing to disagree with there. Yet time after time in the last few years, what we've actually seen is discrimination and victimisation of women workers that has been at best ignored and too often actively abetted by trade unions' own version of inclusive equality, and they've in fact ignored the Equality Act. Let me use an example of an incident that happened in May 2024 at Epsom and St Helier University Hospital. A black female nurse, Jennifer Melee, indirectly called a 6-foot transgender patient Mr. while on the phone to a consultant. The patient, who I'll call Mr. X, was having treatment on the ward, having been transferred from a male prison. He was chained to 2 guards, and Mr. X is serving a sentence for luring young boys into sex acts on the internet while pretending to be a woman. For Ms. Melee's alleged misgendering, Mr. X, the convict, violently lunged at her, screaming, "Do not call me Mr. I'm an effing woman," and then called her the N-word, screamed it at her. He, of course, used the full words in those instances, and he screamed that word at her 3 times. After her shift, Jennifer went home shaken but resilient about the reality of unpleasant abuse at work. She was then contacted by her hospital trust. You might think it was a welfare check, but no, there was no mention of support for the racist attack. Instead, she was issued with a written warning, and the trust reported her to the Nursing and Midwifery Council to investigate her fitness to practice because she posed a risk to the public, it was said, and the reputation of the NHS for not using the patient's preferred gender identity. Only when Jennifer went public and the story hit the media did the trust say they'd investigate the racist abuse. But by then, they had suspended Jennifer for telling her story. Then they moved her to another hospital, demoted her to a lower grade, and she lost pay, etc. Now, I'd have assumed that this shocking story would be a huge equality at work story for the trade union movement to take up. An ethnic minority female frontline health worker, a victim of explicit racist harassment and male violence all over the papers, and then gross discriminatory employer behaviour. But no, not a dicky bird. A deafening silence in the nursing unions and the TUC. Maybe Nurse Jennifer was, as an open evangelical Christian rather than a trade unionist, the wrong kind of victim. But recently we heard that another nurse, Sandy Peggy, an RCN member for 30 years, has been forced to sue the Royal College of Nursing, her union, for their failure to support or provide legal assistance when she was suspended by NHS Fife. And her crime was that she challenged the presence of Dr. Beth Upton, a biological man, in the women-only changing rooms at the Victoria Hospital, Kilcuddy. That nurse Peggy's legal action is necessary should shame the trade union movement. As Mrs. Peggy's solicitor, Margaret Grimmin, explained, her client expected the union to, quote, exercise its industrial muscle to challenge the trust's discriminatory decision, which was adversely impacting on her and other female union members, and she alleged that she spoke to the union about the issue of single-sex bases in February last year. So in relation to this amendment, how can we mandate employers to provide generous facilities time to trade union equalities work with such a risible attitude to the real-life attacks on equality at work as evidence? When Ms. Peggy is forced to take legal action to get justice from her own union, I'm not sure I want any more union equalities officers. Susan Smith of the For Women Scotland organisation, which brought the successful Supreme Court action, notes, quote, "We imagine this is likely to be the first of many such cases. Sadly, it seems that only financial penalties will persuade the unions to step up, do their job and represent women in the workplace." Now, my Lords, there's been a lot of fine words in this chamber related to this bill about fighting for women's equality at work. Yet, in a profession which is 90% female, nursing, basic rights have been thrown under the bus, often with the acquiescence, even the support, of workplace trade union reps. To note, nurses of all people need to get changed at work into uniforms when they arrive at the hospital. Throughout the day, if their clothing becomes soiled or contaminated, it's part of the job, minimising risk of infection. In a stressful frontline job, the last thing nurses need is to be self-conscious or anxious when getting ready to work long hours on the wards. That's why single-sex changing rooms are important and indeed mandated by health and safety regulations fought for by earlier generations of trade unionists, but no longer. Yes, the trade unions should be highlighting these recent attacks on hard-won women's rights at work, but they aren't. Instead, they often stand with employers to betray their own members. The fight has been left to a ground war by courageous female workers, and it's so bad, officially, that a group of nurses from County Durham have had to set up their own Darlington Nurses Union, and I am glad to see the Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting, supporting them. Clause 62 mandates that 2A requires time off to be given for the purpose of promoting the value of equality in the workplace, and 2C says providing information, advice or support to qualifying members of the trade union in relation to equality in the workplace. But I have to ask exactly which ideas of equality will be promoted, what information or advice will be given, what aspects of equality will be ascribed value. After all the evidence shows that on a key contemporary fight for women's equality, there's been a one-sided ideological conformity in national unions' policies, certainly at a leadership level. It's shocking that so many unions have declared that they will defy the Supreme Court's clarification of equality law, which rather begs the question, which version of equality will equality reps be promoting in the workplace? Will such legal misinformation be part of learning and training in working hours that Clause 62 requires? Because more broadly, it should concern us that equality training is now routinely dominated by a particular EDI worldview. Indeed, equality, diversity and inclusion norms have corrupted any traditional understanding of equality by its insistence on presenting social, economic and employment issues through the prism of identity politics and critical social theory. Often trade union bureaucrats work hand in glove with senior management and HR to embed EDI in workplaces, such as the union's collaboration with ACAS on developing the EDI policy template. And what does such EDI-inspired trade union equality training look like? Some examples. Racial literacy modules, including inclusive language codes with charts listing problematic words. Or another that promises training to help spot and correct unconscious bias, microaggressions, Islamophobia. And this feels like treating fellow workers as problems who need to be re-educated. Or to quote another course that offers, quote, resources to help reps recognise how white workers may unknowingly benefit from inequitable biases. So less the positive trade union aspiration of black and white unite and fight, and more the student union campaigns against white privilege. Surely that is regressive and divisive. And to quote the former chair of the EHRC, Trevor Phillips, in a comment piece in The Times recently, he wrote, DEI programmes increasingly appear not to be aimed at making the workplace a better, more productive environment, but a modern-day inquisition dedicated to damning white male workers merely for existing. In such a politically toxic atmosphere, when the trade unions seem as much of a hindrance as a help in relation to equality at work, I'm simply probing why the government would use this legislation to push facilities time and a lot of detail on facilities time specifically for equality reps. I would say that would lead to disastrous outcomes.